That year, Hung had to move into a cheap rental house because of work. The place was old and hidden deep inside a narrow alley. It was a 3-story building with peeling yellow walls and wooden stairs that creaked every time someone stepped on them. The rent was strangely low enough to make him uneasy, but he wanted to save money, so he moved in anyway. The landlady was a thin woman in her 60s who barely spoke. When she handed him the key, she stared at him for a long moment and gave him a strange warning. At night, no matter what you hear from the last room at the end of the 3rd floor hallway, don't open the door. Hung gave an awkward smile. He thought she was just superstitious. His room was on the 2nd floor, right across from the stairs. The 3rd floor above him had a long, dim hallway with 3 closed rooms. Once, he asked why those rooms were never rented out. The woman's face immediately changed. "No one can stay there," she said. For the first few days, nothing happened. Hung went to work in the morning, came home at night, shut his door, and went to sleep. But on the 4th night, just as he was drifting off, he heard something being dragged across the wooden floor directly above his head. Creak, scrape, creak, scrape. The sound was slow and heavy, as if someone were pulling an old piece of furniture down the 3rd floor hallway. Hung opened his eyes and checked the time. 2:17 a.m. He sat up and listened. The dragging sound stopped directly above his room. Then, everything went quiet. A few seconds later, he heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft taps from the ceiling, as if someone was knocking gently from the room above him. The next morning, Hung asked the landlady, "Was someone upstairs last night?" The woman froze in the middle of sweeping the yard. Her broom stopped moving. "I already warned you," she said quietly. "Whatever you hear, ignore it." Then she turned and walked away. After that, the noises came every single night. Sometimes it was the dragging sound. Sometimes it sounded like a wooden chair falling over. Sometimes it was slow footsteps moving back and forth along the hallway above him, barefoot, steady, patient. Then came the storm. One night, heavy rain pounded the roof, while the lights inside the house flickered on and off. At nearly 3 in the morning, Hung was lying in bed when he heard someone knock on his door. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow knocks. He sat up instantly. "Who's there?" No answer. Hung looked through the peephole. The hallway outside was dark and empty. For a second, he thought he had imagined it. Then the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, louder. Hung reached for the doorknob, and just then, the landlady's voice suddenly rang out from the staircase, trembling and urgent. "Don't open it." Hung flinched and pulled his hand back. He cracked the door just enough to look outside. The old woman was standing at the foot of the stairs, pale as paper, clutching a string of prayer beads in one hand. Her lips moved as if she were whispering a prayer. When she looked at him, her eyes were full of fear. "It's testing you," she whispered. "It wants to see if you'll open the door." Hung felt every hair on his body stand up. He slammed the door shut. That night, the knocking never fully stopped. It moved around his room. Sometimes it came from the front door, sometimes from the wall beside his bed. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from underneath the bed itself. The next morning, a streak of black water had seeped in through the crack beneath the door. It smelled damp, rotten, and old. That was when Hung finally became truly afraid. He took the morning off work and decided to go upstairs to see what was really there. In daylight, the third-floor hallway was covered in dust. All three doors looked ancient and untouched. The first room was empty, except for cobwebs and broken wood. The second room was locked from the outside, with a rusted padlock. The last room, at the very end of the hall, was slightly open. As Hung walked toward it, the air around him turned noticeably colder. A thick smell of mold hit him before he even reached the doorway. The door wasn't locked. Inside was a small, dark room filled with old furniture covered in yellowing white sheets. On the wall opposite the bed hung a large mirror, cracked straight down the middle. Across the wooden floor were long scratch marks, deep and uneven, as if someone had once clawed desperately at the boards. Hung took one step inside. The door behind him slowly swung shut. Bang! He spun around, his heart slamming in his chest. When he turned back toward the mirror, he saw someone standing behind him. A woman. She had long black hair hanging over her face and wore a white dress stained gray with age and filth. Her arms hung limply at her sides. Her skin was so pale it almost looked translucent. Hung's body went cold. He whipped around. There was no one there. But in the mirror, she was still standing behind him. Slowly, she raised her head. Behind the curtain of wet black hair was a twisted face with dark, hollow eyes sunken deep into her skull. Her mouth stretched wider and wider into a grin that seemed to split her face open. Hung screamed and threw himself at the door. He pushed it open. It wouldn't open. He grabbed the knob and yanked with all his strength, but it felt locked from the outside. Then he heard it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of fingernails dragging across wood. It was coming from under the bed. A woman's voice, dry and broken, whispered right beside his ear. "Stay with me." Hung turned slowly. A pale hand slid out from beneath the bed. Then another. Something began crawling out. It was the woman from the mirror, but her body was bent in impossible ways. Her neck hanging crooked to one side, her legs dragging uselessly behind her, as though the bones inside them had snapped long ago. Each time she moved, her joints cracked with a dry, brittle sound. Hung kicked the door and screamed until his throat burned. Just as the thing crawled close enough to touch his feet, the door burst open. The landlady stood there, her hand shaking as she held a bundle of burning incense. "Run!" Hung didn't wait. The two of them bolted down to the second floor. Behind them, from the end of the hallway, came a harsh, rasping laugh, followed by that familiar dragging sound across the wood. Only then did the landlady finally tell him the truth. 20 years earlier, the last room had belonged to a young woman who rented it alone. People in the neighborhood said she had been abandoned by the man she loved, and one stormy night, she took her own life inside that room. But when they broke the door open, they didn't find her hanging from the ceiling. They found her under the bed. Her eyes were wide open. Her fingernails had broken off. Blood was smeared all across the floorboards, as though she had tried to crawl out in absolute terror before she died. From that day on, no one could stay in that room. Everyone who tried lasted only a few nights. They all heard the knocking. They all heard the dragging sounds in the hallway. And they all saw a woman in the mirror. Some ran away screaming. Some became feverish and delirious. And one tenant disappeared without a trace. The moment Hung heard that, he decided he was leaving that very afternoon. But the rain that evening was too heavy. The alley flooded, and no moving truck could get inside. The landlady told him to stay one more night, lock the door, and no matter what he heard, do not come out. That night, Hung stuffed cloth into his ears and pulled the blanket over his head. But at exactly 2:17 a.m., the dragging sound returned. Creak, scrape, creak, scrape. It moved from one end of the third-floor hallway all the way to the staircase. Then it stopped right outside Hung's room. Silence. Then came the knocking. Knock, 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 knock. 3 slow taps. Hung clenched his teeth and said nothing. A few moments later, the knocking changed. It became scratching, soft at first, then sharper, as if long fingernails were carving lines into the wooden door. Hung trembled so violently he could barely breathe. Then he heard her voice from the other side, soft, patient, almost amused. "I know you're still awake." Tears filled Hung's eyes. He gripped the blanket tighter and forced himself not to move. A few minutes later, everything went silent. He thought it was over. Then, the small mirror hanging across from his bed made a cracking sound. A thin fracture spread across the glass, and inside the reflection, he saw her. The woman was standing directly behind him on the bed. Hung didn't even have time to turn around. 2 freezing hands settled gently onto his shoulders. The next morning, the landlady came upstairs and called his name. There was no answer. She broke the door open. The room was empty. The door was still locked from the inside. The small mirror on the wall had shattered into pieces, and across the floor was a trail of black water leading out into the hallway and straight up to the 3rd floor. From that day on, the house was abandoned. People in the alley still say that on rainy nights, if you stand outside the gate and look up at the 3rd floor, you can see a figure standing in the window of the last room at the end of the hall. No one knows if it is the woman who died there long ago, or Hung.